to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. When we traditionally think about disruption, we often think about weather, hurricanes, tornadoes, floodings, etc. Today, though, disruptions come in many forms. Certainly, weather remains a big one, but so is cyber risk. There's software outages and regional wars, material shortages and trade wars, and even pandemics, as we learned recently. The list is lengthy. And the reality is that disruption is now an everyday occurrence and supply chains need to be ready. But are they? Hello and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm pleased you have chosen to join me today as we dive into the world of risk mitigation by asking one simple question: what is your level of risk tolerance? And to help us find the answer to that is Loren Johnson, Senior Director of Product Marketing and the Risk Evangelist at Aravo. Loren, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
Before we dive into this topic, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Aravo and what you guys do?
Sure. I have been doing product marketing in the GRC, governance risk compliance market for about 8 years. Before that, I was a market analyst. I find that this is a really interesting market. I know that some people look at GRC as there's nothing more, corporate compliance than compliance itself in GRC. So, but if you look at the news, if you look at the stories in the world, there is so much coverage about GRC these days, and especially about third-party risk. I find that third-party risk and kind of our 21st century challenges, which are, cyber risk, like you mentioned, ESG, sustainability, some other elements of how companies are actually optimizing supply chains as being really, really interesting. And, there's always new regulatory changes. There's changes in how the market is perceiving this. There's changes in how stakeholders and shareholders care about this kind of thing. So this is a really important space, and it's getting more important all the time. Aravo is a third-party risk management vendor. We've been in this space for about 25 years. We tend to serve companies that have really demanding and maybe complex kind of environments. We're able to kind of scale and diversify as these kind of regulatory changes and other pressures come in, and as companies are doing more and more across their supply chains, integrating more partners, integrating more vendors, integrating more joint ventures, any other kind of third-party engagement you have globally. So it's a product that's really designed for an expanding market and more demands from big companies.
Yep. So a great overview and great insight, and certainly I think you're the perfect person to have on here because you've got a lot of experience in this area. So I'm glad that you're here to talk about this. And I think you're right. I think it's a topic that doesn't get spoken about enough.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think there's probably a lot of listeners out there that they're hearing us talk about this and say, oh, risk mitigation, like I'm good with that, right? I'm all set. I'm quite confident in what we have in place. But I know you subscribe to the theory that companies cannot avoid all third-party risk incidents, no matter how prepared they are. So can you kind of explain why you believe that it's really impossible to eliminate all the risks? Is it just too many of them out there, or is there another reason why you just can't do it?
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot. I think you touched on it earlier about, you have outages and things, but I mean, the world is changing fast. You look at stories like recently we had the CrowdStrike issue where they had a corrupt file that went out and it affected businesses across airlines and other industries. And, they're a third party. The companies who worked with CrowdStrike had an issue with concentration risk in that case and technology risk where they didn't have any backups. In a lot of cases, they didn't have any resiliency strategies in place that could have helped them get back up on their feet quicker. CrowdStrike says we put out a patch out an hour later. It shouldn't have taken down, airlines for 2 or 3 days, but it did. And that kind of represents some of the challenges around outages and concentration risk and delivery risk, things like this. But you also have things around, people really care about supply chain risk and sustainability now. You have issues like where sriracha, the hot sauce, was using one farm in northern Mexico to supply its peppers, and they had a drought and they had to kind of slow down production for a while, and there was a bit of a shortage. That's a concentration risk with a third party. You have other kinds of risks that are expanding all the time, kind of assurances risk, delivery risk. The Panama Canal had a drought, and the shipping companies were bribing each other to get in front of each other in the line to get through the Panama Canal. All these kinds of things can affect a business to its heart. It's affecting are you able to deliver to your customers? Can you absorb an additional cost because of things like that? Are you able to continue operating and being resilient as you should be?
Yeah.
I think when you look at risk, companies are going to be, assessing onboarding. They're going to be assessing kind of, what are the challenges across these different kind of risk domains for each of my third parties? How do I ensure I can continue to do business with these companies if I can? What's my backup? What's my other options? How do you kind of use your systems to reduce that risk to better address it? How do you apply your controls and other measures, preventative measures, to make that risk something your company can absorb? And we're going to talk about risk tolerance, but risk tolerance comes down to what can you live with as a risk? What can your company actually accept? And
Mhm.
it really is different across those risk categories and risk domains.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the risk tolerance, and I think the assumption we have is that if we can't eliminate all the risks, then that takes us back to the question that I asked in the open, right? What is your
Right.
risk tolerance? So can you explain what do you mean by that, and what approach should businesses take to defining their risk tolerance?
Sure. And actually, I'll come back to your last question too about you can't eliminate risk. You can never really eliminate risk, and I think that risk professionals understand it. You can kind of change its character. You can reduce it. You can apply all your kinds of defenses and things against it, but you're still going to have something that remains. And risk tolerance is basically defining that, saying I can live with this risk that remains. I've done everything I can to reduce it. I've done my due diligence. I've done my assignment of controls and applications of other kinds of defenses. And I can defend this. If I have a situation where something occurs, I can defend it to my shareholders, I can defend it to auditors, I can defend it to enforcement agencies. But essentially, your process, your risk management process, is you have your risk appetite. You're going to say, there are criteria I can't work with. I'm not working with a North Korean company. It's just too much risk. I mean, there are companies that do that, and sometimes they get busted, and that's bad for them. Um, but you're taking that appetite, you're sending your risk through your channel of controls and applications and assessments and questionnaires and all that kind of stuff. And you come out with a residual risk at the end and you say, well, this is still too much. I still can't do business with this party because there's cyber risk or there's some kind of corruption risk or something else. And you can apply additional controls to that to kind of reduce it some more, or maybe change its character, maybe divert it, or maybe find a way to have some other company absorb it for you, kind of put somebody in between you and them. And at the end, you get this recharacterized risk. Like you're taking a basketball and shrinking it down to a golf ball kind of thing. And at some point, you say the company has this tolerance that we can accept that. We're going to gamble, maybe, but hopefully not. We think the likelihood and the severity of this risk is greatly reduced, and it's something that we can live with. If you look at kind of quantifying that element of tolerance, there's going to be things that you're going to have zero tolerance on. You might have zero tolerance for child labor. You might have zero tolerance for slavery. You might have zero tolerance for sanctions violations. You might have zero tolerance even for cybersecurity kinds of things. We have companies that will look at, are you, compliant with some of the frameworks and standards in the marketplace? And if so, that's great. We can move forward. We can take the next steps. If not, then that's a veto. You just can't work with those people. So you can quantify that, but it's not like it's something that you can that some other risks are going to be more kind of flexible. You're going to have to kind of evaluate along the way. And I think that the art and science of third-party risk management is really knowing, what's that threshold? Where does a company accept a risk and have that tolerance defined? And where does the risk professional then know what to do with it and kind of, make the most of it or create advantage from it or otherwise, make that something that the company can absorb.
Yeah. So as you try to define that, right,
Yeah.
is that something that you can quantify? I mean, are there business metrics depending on the risk that you can look at? Is this something that the CEO just says, no, I don't want to take a chance here? Or is this kind of a feel kind of approach, right? I mean, I use tariffs, like we got an election coming up in this country, so I'll use tariffs
Right.
because that's the thing. It's like, somebody may just simply say, you know what, I just don't think that tariffs will go into effect, so I'm okay not worrying about that
Right.
kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I think that for quantifying it, for setting metrics to it, it's going to be really distinct to each business, and maybe even distinct to individual risk and
Mhm.
individual divisions within a company, maybe different locations. And your risk professional really has to grasp that and understand it and then apply it. And then you're going to have a history of, what's worked before and what are our criteria for this. And you may be building your history along the way with certain kinds of risks. I mean, the pandemic, like you mentioned, was something that some companies had it in their risk kind of matrix about likelihood and severity and expectations and are we going to be resilient? But I think the impact was much broader and much deeper across industries than most expected. And
Yeah.
so some companies were taken offline and some were not. But if you're looking for metrics, yes, you have the zero tolerance things like I mentioned, slavery, child labor, stuff like that. But you also are going to have kind of a a model that's going to be flexible. And yes, you may have an executive have, kind of escalate a challenge up to the executive and make a decision, but a risk program should be well enough defined and risk-based that you can kind of look at these risk tolerances that you have as an organization and make evaluations and make judgments, hopefully with the most information you can possibly get from your own systems, your own history, your own risk intelligence providers and things, and then make a wise decision. And that, realistically, when you look at the rules and you look at like what the DOJ says about compliance programs, they don't say absolute, you must not do this, you must do that. They say you have to have a reasonable approach and a defensible approach. And I think if you're looking at your risk tolerance and you're making decisions, you just have to be defensible. You have to be able to explain why the decision was made this way or not. And metrics can play a role in that, but I think a lot of it has to do with what's a reasonable risk-based approach and how is that something that defended the organization and reduced risk for them.
Yeah, because it's probably pretty easy to say, hey, well, the government is saying don't do business with countries that allow
Yeah,
child labor, right? That's an easy
right.
thing to sit there and say, hey, that's simple. I can deal with that. You brought up the pandemic, right? I think there's probably a lot of companies out there are saying, you know what? I'm not likely to live through a pandemic again, so I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah,
I'm not concerned about that right now. And if it happens, it happens, but I'm not going to spend any time, money, resources.
right. But I think one of the most interesting things that happened in the pandemic in terms of third-party risk is that companies are expanding their number of third parties that they're working with, but they're
Yeah.
also kind of consolidating them into larger kind of groupings or larger companies. They've kind of cut ties with small companies that they think won't survive another pandemic event, and they've asked other third parties to be more strategic, to own more of that kind of relationship and expand their own relationships with the, for lack of a better term, the first party, the people who are
Yeah.
engaging, the companies engaging them. So you're seeing kind of deeper, more strategic engagements across third parties. And that, of course, increases the risk as well. You have more financial commitment, you have more kind of operational commitment, you have more kind of supply chain concentration and assurance risks there. So that environment changes all the time, and it's just something you have to be on top of.
Yeah. And I think I had read, I probably am going to get this number wrong, but that what I read was that companies that, within the global supply chain, a company that integrates its data with another company, a supplier's data,
Mhm.
it's not just that one company. It can be up to 1,000 companies for each
Oh
integration,
yeah.
you
Oh,
know?
for sure, for sure. Actually, Gartner came out a couple years ago and said 60% of companies have more than 1,000 third parties that they engage with. And I think that's probably a little low. If you're even a medium-sized company and you look at, all the companies that you engage with, from, basic contractors all the way through software vendors to suppliers that are, irreplaceable widgets or whatever it is, your number of third parties you're engaging with can really grow quickly.
Yeah.
And then if you look at their third parties, the fourth party and nth parties, you're rapidly going into tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies that you're working with directly or indirectly, and you're liable for all of it. So, when the government comes and looks at FCPA evaluations and things, they're looking down the chain and seeing where you could have done better in terms of protecting your business and assessing that risk and making risk-based decisions.
Yeah. So let's shift this conversation just a little bit and start with the concept of, okay, we're ready to do this now. We're going to build a risk strategy or risk tolerance levels, yeah, we're comfortable with. So what do you see as the biggest areas of concern for companies when they go about that process to start building that risk strategy?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple things that kind of stand out that we see in the market commonly. One thing is executive buy-in, kind of leadership commitment to this kind of program. Um, Risk management and risk altogether is central to how a company defines its strategies. I mean, a lot of companies win by taking a little bit of risk on something and making that kind of calculation about can they do this or not? Can they open a new market? Can they, launch a new product? All that kind of stuff, which there is risk associated with, and often some degree of third-party risk. But you need to have that kind of executive level commitment to a good program that is able to show you the data and the insights and kind of the processes and things where your risks are so you can take advantage of those risks and run a better program overall for the business. Another thing is kind of program maturity. We see a lot of companies that are using software that's not built for this and software that has a lot of limitations. You can't automate things. You can't kind of do comparative evaluations and things that really help you surface where your risks are and able to take charge of those kind of put in place mitigation and other kinds of defensive measures and things. And you have fragmented programs that are dispersed across teams, across companies, across locations that kind of build kind of a confusing kind of market and data that doesn't speak to each other, and then it's really hard to kind of report up the command levels to people who need to make decisions, so it can really mess things up. And ultimately you have a kind of lack of urgency where the market is very dynamic anyway, but you also have a lot of regulations. You also have, like I said, a lot of stories in the news with cyber issues and bribery issues and concentration risk issues and other things. And there is definitely a demand among customers, among partners, among your key stakeholders to get this right. And there's a little bit of a lag, so that's a concern.
Yep. So it's basically you kind of looking at leadership, maturity, and urgency focus kind of approach here.
Yeah.
So let's dig into each of those. A couple questions on each thing. We'll start with maybe the leadership component of this. When developing the strategy, is this something that falls to a single leader in an organization to develop that risk strategy? I mean, the CEO kind of level, executive level, or is this something that each department may need to create on its own?
Well, it's done both ways, but I think the best systems we've seen are led by a champion, somebody who is an advocate for the program and can really address how it's beneficial and instrumental to the success of the company. I think it really depends on the industry. You're going to see a different leader in finance as you will from maybe a pharmacy or maybe manufacturing or CPG or something else. What we often see is a chief risk officer who's running kind of an enterprise risk program, which would include third-party risk. Mm-hmm. And maybe compliance and some other elements. You may see a chief compliance officer, you may see a head of procurement, you may see a CISO. In some companies, the CISO, the technology leader, is the one who's kind of leading third-party risk because their primary focus is cyber risk across third parties. Often when you have really interdependent programs and really strategic partners, that's a place where a lot of the risk is first assessed. What we've seen is we have a customer I know of well who works at a pharmaceutical company who had 6 different divisions running different programs, different teams, different software, and she had to go through the CEO essentially to get them all to combine into one program with one leader, one reporting structure, one data system, and one ability to kind of combine things to be able to assess that risk more fairly. And that kind of system obviously is going to work better because you have this company-wide kind of challenge, and you want to make sure that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. So, yeah.
So it is a leader. There needs to be a leader, right? Is somewhere. I mean,
Yeah.
in a best case, even if each department may be operating a little independently in some ways.
Yeah, you want to have, I mean, ultimately you want to have something that can be audited, can be, an enforcement agency can look at it and understand what you're doing with your program, and you can defend it. That's from the legal side, but just operationally, you're going to run something more effectively and more efficiently if you have it all in one system. If you have, one set of data that you can use to surface risks, that you can use to better understand where and how your risks are affecting your business, it's just more efficient to do that.
So early in the conversation, you mentioned that some departments may have different risk tolerance levels, right? Depending on
Yeah.
the department, depending on the area of the business. So when building a strategy here, building a risk strategy, can you create a single a strategy for the whole company, or is that something that can be created maybe with a, hey, here's the general guidelines we're going to follow. Now each department go and fit your strategy within that overall
Yeah,
overarching document.
it's kind of a matrix, right? Because you're going to have different kinds of risks, and you're going to have these different departments, different locations, and things. I would say you can have a risk tolerance model that has some flexibility across your different divisions, different locations, and those different kind of segmented areas. But there are going to be things that are going to be instructed by that kind of zero tolerance policy that's across the company. So you're going to have, zero tolerance for slavery and things like that. And in cybersecurity, I think it's better to have a single approach, a single governance rule, because there's much less flexibility there. Any division that fails in that cybersecurity issue is going to affect the whole company, and you know, depending on what happens, affect your reputation, your operations, your finances, and all the rest of that kind of stuff. So um, I think that the way it's actually deployed, yes, you're going to have some flexibility and tolerance, understanding and expectations across different divisions and different risks. But ultimately, you do have to answer to somebody, and you have to kind of justify your thinking to the champion that we just talked about. So yes, there's realistically some flexibility. Ultimately, there should be some rules that are pretty hard set.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's shift to the maturity
Yeah.
point that you mentioned. Some companies, I think they overestimate what their maturity level is on these things. So can you kind of explain what you mean, what we mean by that, if you're overestimating your maturity level, and how would they even know that they've overestimated it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough. I think it's a character of the industry altogether that people are trying to build better programs and are trying to address more risks and things. And one of the things that we talk about is, start small and start building out programs that you can accomplish what you need to. Think big, think about where you're going to get to, kind of lay out your strategies and your models, and move fast. So you're actually going to be building out things and improving these kinds of, I've done this, this is something we can accomplish now, let's take the next step. You get kind of the buy-in from the executives and others that have some influence over it. But overestimating. So recently we did a survey of financial markets about their third-party risk programs, and we asked about, how mature is your program? And most people said pretty good. They're fairly mature, and they had software in place, they had reporting in place, they could, create the executive reports they needed to make decisions. But when we asked them about, is it something that's defensible to a enforcement agency? Is it something that would pass an audit? Most people were a little bit less confident about it. And especially if you look at things like, how is the expansive risk environment changing, what your challenges are and things, there's not a lot of confidence out there when you get into details. And even with, defining risk tolerance and things, it's a little bit too vague for my comfort, and for probably a lot of those kinds of enforcement agencies and things would find some fault there. So, it's not insurmountable. I think people are pretty aware that they have challenges. There are expanding needs all the time, and not just, the risk categories expanding, but leaning into fourth party risk and fifth party risk, leaning into this 21st century risks that are changing the demands of the programs all the time. ESG is opening up a whole lot of new risks, and especially across third parties that these companies have not really integrated into their programs yet.
Yeah.
When you look at some of the regulations that are coming out that are pretty well defined, the SEC has their cybersecurity reporting requirements. The SEC has recently this year talked about climate disclosures. It's not talking about scope 3 yet, which is really your third party risk, or third parties, how they're impacting climate change. But that stuff is coming, and it's coming faster in other areas, and it's coming faster in Europe than it is here. The German Supply Chain Act is requiring companies that do business in Germany to report about environmental impact and child labor and slavery impact. And now you have DORA, this Digital Resiliency Act for the financial market in Europe, that is very, very specific about what your program has to include, and it's not very flexible. So when you look at maturity and what you need to do next, some of those regulations are going to give you good guidelines. We're not there yet. There's still some growth to go, and some people are going to have to really commit and grow their programs.
So I guess that leads nicely to the question of how do you do that, right? How do you build that strategy,
Yeah.
given your current technology or capabilities? I assume that it has to start at least recognizing what you're capable of actually doing.
Yes. And to really prioritize your risks. I mean, it depends on your industry and it depends on your environment and your third party ecosystem. Everybody's a little bit different, but you know, if you're working with third parties that keep you up at night, then you need to make some changes. And if your program doesn't actually measure those or allow you to quantify that risk, enable you to make the right decisions, then you need to invest in your program more. It's hard to look at it all and look at the maturity and look at where you should go and actually know. So there's a lot of need for kind of consultative engagement about, what do you do first? What do you do next? How do you best prepare your business and how do you invest in the right elements of the program? There's not like one answer for anybody. I would say at this point where there's so much news about things like third parties and deeply integrated into technology systems, with AI and other things that are driving a lot of concerns across industries. Is it safe? Is it something that we can work with? Can our third parties use AI? How do we change our scoring of that risk associated with that? You need to look at the technology risks, I would say in a lot of cases first, and then, build out other program elements, build out your sustainability risk if you have that, build out your fraud risk if you have that, take those steps, kind of model it out. And if it takes a couple of years, that's probably okay as long as you're showing effort and, able to defend the program. But yeah, it's there's so much happening that it's tough to quickly identify where your focus should be and then build out from there.
Yeah. So it keeps you guys busy, I assume.
Yeah, for sure.
We talked about leadership, we've talked about maturity. The third part of that concern that you mentioned earlier on was kind of the focus, right, and the urgency out
Hmm.
there. And given how many disruptions that exist today, I mean, I couldn't even, we mentioned a bunch of them, and I'm sure we probably only touched 2% of what's there, if that. So
Yeah,
how do you create that focus? How do you make that part of your calculation? And especially for companies that say, well, I want to eliminate risk, which is just a broad statement, right? I just want to
right.
eliminate risk. So, so how do you focus a company? How does a company get focused on what risk domains to attack? How do they do that without wanting to try to tackle everything and creating this project that's just impossible to complete?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think yeah, it's so defined by your own organization and what your requirements are and how you do business and where the risks are in terms of business continuity and regulatory risk and all the rest of the stuff we've talked about here. I would come back to the start small, think big, move fast, because you have to be able to step back and take a look at what you do well and what you don't do well. And, relatively speaking, how does each of those kinds of risk categories, and I'm saying risk categories, about things like concentration risk, about anti-bribery corruption risk, about financial risk otherwise. But these days, so much of risk is really moving out of those kind of arbitrary swim lanes and crossing over into multiple kinds of risks at one time. And, like the pandemic was detrimental to businesses across those kinds of categories. But you have to be able to step back and look at where the priorities are for the business. Where can you commit resources? What kind of systems do you need for this? What kind of reporting do you need? How do you build something that's defensible and just take step by step? It's it's um it's always going to be challenging because these disruptions are occurring and they're changing, and you can feel like you're left behind or you're pushing a rock up a hill. But there I think these days, if you look at how companies are pursuing this well and enforcement agencies are going after companies, they're not looking for an absolute answer often. If you look at the FCPA, for example, or the DOJ, how they have this guidance for corporate compliance programs, they say in it that you need to have a reasonable approach. They're not saying you have to close all doors and eliminate all risk, because that's essentially impossible. But what they're saying is take a risk-based approach, apply additional efforts where the risk requires it, and be reasonable. And they want you to be upfront and honest with them about what you're doing, and that means prioritizing stuff and investing where it needs to be invested first, and then moving forward once you've already accomplished it, and kind of building blocks toward a better program.
Yep. So you can't take 100 steps. You take that till you take that first one.
Yeah, totally. Yep.
Yeah,
It's a mountain to climb, but it starts with first step, right? So,
yeah.
yeah.
So as you do that and you focus and say, hey, I want to attack this area or I want to attack that area, there are certainly areas of your business that are going to be left unprotected, or at
Yeah.
least to some extent. So is there anything that you can do as a company and organization to at least give you some level of comfort that I only attack these two areas, I got these three over here to the right that I'm not that I'm worried about. Is there anything that I can do about those three without diving deep into that while I'm trying to solve these other two issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to juggle, right? I think for supply chain people in particular, there is always challenges with anti-bribery and corruption risk and FCPA and things. That's been around for a long time, for nearly 50 years. The FCPA has, and most companies, I would think, have that pretty well under control in terms of how they do procurement, how they find suppliers, how they work with suppliers, and even on the other side of the equation, suppliers are pretty comfortable with providing the right kind of confidence and confirmation of how they operate and things.
Yeah.
Um, but I think at this point, a lot of what we're seeing in the market is associated with concentration risk and things with sustainable supply chains, things where there's droughts and where there's floods and where there's other challenges, geopolitical challenges, other things like this that can take a company offline. And if they're not prepared, don't have a resiliency strategy in place, then they get they lose out some from it. So, from a supply chain perspective, the assurance, confirmation, the performance management, the kind of contractual elements, SLAs and things, that's all kind of tied into concentration risk and your ability to kind of move around if you need to, um, and focusing on that because ultimately you're trying to keep delivering services to your customers. Um, if you have anti-bribery corruption kind of down, which I think most companies do to a defensible level, then you really need to focus on what's next. What are my biggest challenges? And I would say for supply chain that assurance is the concentration risk is a big deal. Um, there's more technology all the time, so cyber risks are certainly there, but focus on what you can accomplish first and measurable impact on the business, and then keep moving through the next sections.
Yeah. Um, we've discussed a lot of stuff today, and
Yeah.
I want to give you one final question, kind of because I want to try to summarize this for our audience, if you will, right? So,
Yep.
can you kind of summarize what the key points that you think companies need to be aware of, and how they should go about thinking about attacking their risk exposure?
Yeah, so I would say that this is a really important market. I think as we talked about it from the start, it is not a dormant thing. It is moving quickly all the time. The risks are changing, the assessments are changing. The importance of this is elevating where it's in the news every single day, some kind of third-party risk issue. It's very dynamic. There's a lot of regulatory activity. There's a lot of increasing expectations from your stakeholders. The market is asking for more scrutiny, more accountability, more transparency. Um, these things are driving a lot of changes in expectations for the market. And I think that there are internally a lot of expectations evolving as well. The companies want more efficient, more effective programs. They don't want to be that company that's in the news. They want to make sure that when they're investing in something like this, it's actually effective for the business. So it's a really important time to take this seriously. I think we talk a lot about this time to get serious for third-party risk management, and I think it really is. There's few excuses nowadays to not understand what this challenge is or to not actually attack it and commit resources to it. So it's a good time to really step up and invest in these programs and make it work for the company.
Yep. And there used to be an old saying, right, that any news is good news, but there actually is bad news, and you don't want to be the company that's in the bad news.
Yeah, totally.
Loren, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. We are just about out of time. If people want to get in touch with yourself or Aravo, what's the best way for them that they can do that?
I'm happy to get any emails from anybody at ljohnson@aravo.com. And I can certainly channel that to anybody else who may need to talk with somebody in the company. And we're always happy to talk to people.
Great, great.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I
Yeah.
want to thank my
Thank you,
guest
Brian.
today. I want to thank my guest today, Loren Johnson of Aravo, for joining us, and a special thank you to each of you out there who took time out of your day to listen to us. This podcast would not be possible without your support, so I thank you very much for that. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts, so be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.